on Friday in Mecca, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif signed a trilateral defense agreement stating that an attack on one will be treated as an attack on all three. The language deliberately echoes NATO's Article 5. They insist the pact is purely defensive and not directed at anyone, but it's hard to ignore the context of the US-Israeli war on Iran, into which Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states have been reluctantly dragged. The war is widening, not resolving. The last month has seen renewed strikes between Yemen's Houthis and Saudi Arabia. On Sunday, the group claimed an attack on the Aramco refinery in Jizan. Joint US-Saudi strikes have also hit Iran-aligned military targets in Iraq. Now, Saudi Arabia is bracing for multiple coordinated attacks. And earlier today, 3 people were reportedly killed in a Houthi attack on a small cargo ship in the Red Sea, in what would be the first deadly strike by the group on a vessel since the wider war began. Meanwhile, Turkey and Pakistan fear instability spilling over their frontiers with Iran. So should we see this pact as a hostile coalition assembling around Iran's perimeter, or just the early scaffolding of a regionally generated security order whose eventual direction is undetermined and whose biggest consequence may fall outside the Iran file entirely? Here to answer is political analyst Trita Parsi. Trita, welcome back to MEE Live. Thank you so much for being here. Now,
Thanks so much for having me.
A pleasure. Days after this pact was signed, Yemen's Houthis launched strikes on Saudi oil facilities and Red Sea ports, testing and exposing potentially the pact's limits. Oh, I'm sorry, this is not what I was going to ask you. My script's just been muddled. And I do want to get your analysis, particularly on the US reaction. But let's start with the positioning of Iran. Now, the signatories have been clear that this is not supposed to be targeted at anybody, but it falls in the context of the Iran war. Will Iran take it that way? Will they see it as, not remotely targeted at them?
I think the way the Iranians will take this is something that is undetermined, but because it's undetermined, it means that there is a likelihood, a risk from their view, that they may end up becoming the target of this. And I think even though these countries may say that this is not targeting Iran, given the fact that it's really not entirely clear what is the organizing principle of this at this point, it means that down the road, the organizing principle may end up being one that is viewing both Iran and Israel, or Iran and Israel separately, as the target of this alliance. But I don't think the Iranians are at this point in a panic or anything of that kind. I think they also see that there is a potential pathway for themselves down the road to be able to be part of this. There were earlier conversations in which there had been pushes, particularly by the Pakistanis, to see Iran included in this as well. But that would be a complicated matter right now, given the fact that Iran is at war with the United States, and obviously these countries are not going to go to war with the US on behalf of Iran, but also because of the tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think fundamentally, the impetus for this is that it is now utterly clear the American security umbrella in the region is nothing but a shadow. It is hollow. It is not reliable, nor is it effective. And as a result, other configurations will come in and try to fill this vacuum. And I don't think this one will be the only one. But the direction that it will go afterwards is not entirely clear. And to a certain extent, it depends on how Iran itself plays its hand. If it ends up becoming very aggressive, if it ends up in various forms of tensions with the other states, or because its power just simply rises, its leverage rises to the point that these countries feel that they have no choice but to try to find a way to balance it, then it may end up becoming something that is trying to counterbalance the Iranians. But if they play their cards right, this can potentially have the pathway in which it will not just be a defense pact that claims that it doesn't target anyone, but it can actually genuinely be a defense pact that is based on collective security, on indivisible security, taking a page or two from the Helsinki process in Europe than OSCE or ASEAN in Asia, rather than a NATO formation that very clearly was created to counter a named enemy, the Soviet Union and later on Russia. That I think ultimately would be very good for the region. But this first step is not deterministic of which direction it will go afterwards.
And I suppose whether or not it is designed primarily to target Iran, at the time of this confrontation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it significantly raises the stakes of any Iranian strike on Saudi Arabia. Will this put pressure on hardline factions of Iran's government, who have seemed unafraid of escalation up to now, in exercising more caution going forwards?
Potentially, but I think it's important to note that the main reason why the Iranians were not targeting Saudi Arabia in the first 38 war was not because of the fear that this would drag in Pakistan into the war, because they did strike Saudi Arabia on numerous occasions, but far less so than other countries. The main reason was because they didn't want to. They wanted to keep a pathway open so that after the war, there would be a way for them to be able to reconcile with the GCC states. And Saudi Arabia, of course, is the most important state there. So it was their own incentives not to go harder against Saudi Arabia. That was the break. Not that there were any threats or that they were fearful of what the Saudi-Pakistani agreement in the midst of that war would have done, because we also saw that it didn't have any impact either on Pakistan's conduct. It still ended up becoming a mediator, or on Iran's conduct. And I also do think that we have to keep in mind all of these type of agreements are only as strong as their credibility. Right now, it seems very, very far-fetched to think that Pakistan would choose to go to war with Iran on behalf of Saudi Arabia, or that Turkey would. Not that these countries are not strong or that they wouldn't have an ability, but because it would really be a lose-lose situation for all of them. Pakistan in particular would create massive domestic problems for the government if it ended up in a war with Iran. So the credibility in terms of it actually being a threat against Iran is at this point very, very low. Things can, of course, change. I would be far more worried if I was sitting in Israel right now than if I was sitting in Tehran.
Before we look at Israel, I want to dive into what you said about Washington, that this is reflective of a real loss of faith in the US's ability to provide security in the region. Will it be taken by the White House as a message along those lines, or will it be welcomed as burden sharing at a time of military confrontation in the area?
I think it should be welcomed as burden sharing, because at the end of the day, the US has for quite some time said that they want to see greater collaboration. But to be frank with you, I think that would be them trying to sell this as something that is a win for the US or for this administration, whereas the actual deeper thinking has not yet shifted in a manner in which the US would proactively want to see these type of arrangements. I know that there are elements in the administration that actually very much and genuinely would welcome the region taking responsibility for its own security and letting the United States pull back, while giving the US, of course, a strong political say in matters, but no longer that type of responsibility. But we have to be honest that there are such strong inertia in the United States and elements that who still believe that every one of these different corners have to be dominated by the United States. And for them, whatever they say, they will see this as a loss.
And now to your point about Israel, why is it that if you were Israel, you would be far more worried than if you were Iran?
Because I think what the Israelis have done is that they have really proven themselves in the eyes of most countries in the region to be the most destabilizing force in the region and the most politically difficult state for the countries in the region to be able to come to terms with. This means that the region will find ways to try to balance against Israel. In the past, however, when the American security umbrella was strong, these states thought that they were protected by the United States, and at the same time, they saw that the US was a very strong supporter of Israel. So there was no incentives for them to try to do anything against Israel. Now you're seeing Israel losing its standing in the United States. It's plummeting. The relationship with the United States and Israel is likely going to be very different 5 years from now than what it is today. And at the same time, you see these regional states feeling that they have no choice but to find ways to create their own deterrence against Israel. What does that do? It means that a certain configuration that the Israelis had sought to achieve and to a certain extent had achieved and benefited from, which was one in which they had deterrence against every state in the region, but because of a variety of factors, including the American security umbrella, these states had no deterrence against Israel. That situation is now going to go away. These states are going to create their own deterrences against Israel, and the United States will have very little to be able to do about that. That's going to create a completely different scenario in the region that will make the Israelis look back to the area prior to October 7th and what they did since then as an era that was actually much more safe for them.
I suppose a follow-up question here is the nuclear question. We've just recently seen Saudi Arabia sign a civil nuclear agreement with the US, as they emphasized. Pakistan is also, of course, a nuclear power. Does the pact mean that its nuclear umbrella now extends to Saudi Arabia and Turkey? And could that have a domino effect?
I doubt that the Pakistanis are formally going to agree to an agreement that essentially says that they're offering that type of umbrella. Now, if it is left unstated, if that is an understanding perhaps, but that they would actually explicitly say that, that I think they recognize would incentivize the Iranians to go in a nuclear direction, whereas in reality, countries in the region do know that if the Iranians really wanted a nuclear weapon, they would have had one by now. It is their own calculations that have caused them to go in the direction of having a nuclear option and a latent nuclear deterrence rather than having an actual nuclear deterrence. But if Pakistan is providing that type of an umbrella, it can trigger processes that eventually will lead to a scenario in which other countries, including Iran, will go in that direction as well.
Now, as you've pointed out, Chitta, this pact deliberately mirrors NATO language. Hakan Fidan, Turkey's foreign minister, he also said it would have NATO-like institutions. But as you point out, a threat is only as good as its credibility. Is this actually a NATO-like alliance we're looking at, or is it just being presented as one?
I think it would be a huge mistake if it ends up becoming a NATO-like alliance. Because again, NATO was explicitly created as a counter to another major power in the Warsaw Pact. And after the Warsaw Pact fell apart, NATO continued to exist. And for quite some time, it was in search of another enemy. If you instead move towards collective security, what the Iraqis were trying to do with the Baghdad dialogue a couple of years ago, that I think is going to have a far greater promise for the region's longer-term security. And it will be something that will be a counter to a movement towards more regional conflict, rather than if you have bloc formations, which at the end of the day, NATO it is a bloc. So as its initial steps here, it does look more like a NATO in the making. But my argument is that I don't think it is set yet. It is not determined yet. And there's still a chance to expand this in a direction that would make it move in the direction of collective security rather than bloc formation and NATO.
And I suppose when they say an attack on one would be considered an attack on all three, deterrence doesn't just have to be military. When it comes to Iran, for example, Turkey and Pakistan sit along overland trade routes that carry significant Iranian commerce. This is more important now that the UAE channel has been complicated by war. So I suppose, restricting the trade or closing borders would have a significant deterrent effect over Iran in a sort of collective deterrence arrangement. Could it be that Saudi Arabia is banking on a different kind of deterrence for Iran here? Or if we're not speaking in targeted language, that collective deterrence may not just be military, it may be looking at other strategies as well.
If this expands and becomes something that increasingly is building institutions and layers of agreements that essentially tie these three countries in a manner that makes it more and more difficult for them to actually have other type of integration with other states, then yes, we may move in the direction that you're saying. It's different, however, if this is a bit more loosely kept and it doesn't preclude economic integration and other forms of integration with other countries in the region. Again, if it ends up becoming a real bloc formation, then it's going to be the former. And again, that's when I think is instead of this adding security, it will add insecurity to the region.
Trita Parsi, thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.